utterly unacceptable that today in 2015 that should still be the case. The Equal Pay Act was passed in the year I was born, which, as you can probably tell, is more than 21 years ago, and I know that's confusing you right now because you thought I was only 21. But passed in the year I was born, and it is nothing short of a disgrace that the political will has not been behind that sufficiently to make sure that 45 years later equal pay is a reality. And the Equal Pay Day that the Fawcett Society marks is, in my view, a very, very graphic example, perhaps the most graphic example of the entrenched inequality that still today in 2015 exists for women across Scotland, across the whole of the UK, and indeed across the world. So let me tell you today, I am determined, as the first woman to hold the post of First Minister of Scotland, I'm determined that I and the government that I'm so proud to lead will do absolutely everything in our power to tackle that inequality. Now, of course, tackling that inequality, I think, should be led by government, but governments can't do it alone. We've got to work with the wider public sector, we've got to work with the private sector, and of course we've got to work with the third sector. So I'm really pleased to see so many fantastic third sector organisations like Engender represented here today. And just as government can't do it on its own, it's also true, and we should just acknowledge this, that there's no single policy, there's no single measure, there's no magic wand that will address gender inequality in its totality. Instead, what we need to do is make sustained and significant progress across a wide range of different areas. So that's why the Scottish Government has increased resources for tackling domestic violence, because it is both a significant cause and a significant symptom of gender inequality. It's why all of us are trying to address gender segregation in the workplace, encouraging more girls and more young women to study science, technology, engineering and maths, and encouraging more men to do some of the jobs that are traditionally female occupations as well. It's why we're so determined to increase childcare provision. We've done so already, and we want to go even further. Something, of course, that the late Ailsa Mackay, amongst others, did so much to advocate, and Ailsa would have absolutely been in her element at this conference today. 3 years ago, we joined with businesses and with trade unions to launch a major campaign to boost female employment, and notwithstanding the challenges we've seen this week in the latest jobs figures for Scotland, we can be proud of the fact, I think, that in the most recent Eurostat publication, which was published a couple of weeks ago, we were seen to be the country with the second highest rate of female employment in the whole of the European Union. That's good, but there's significant progress we still need to make. We are, as government, now working with and talking to the Equality and Human Rights Commission about how we do more to encourage employers to provide much better help and much better support for women who return to work after having children. And that, of course, follows their recent report, which showed that as many as 54,000 new mothers are being forced out of jobs in the UK every single year. And of course, it's why we will continue to take action on the pay gap that I mentioned at the outset. Across the rest of the UK, only those parts of the public sector with more than 150 employees have to publish information on their pay gap. In Scotland, we're going to require that any public sector organisation that has more than 20 employees has to publish their gender pay gap. Because unless we introduce more transparency around this, we're not going to see the progress that we need to make. So we are determined that we will do that. Now, all of these measures, each and every single one of these measures is important, but what I want to focus on in particular today, of course, is how we ensure that women have an equal say in decision making, in politics and in all areas of life. And there are two overwhelming reasons for making sure that women get equality when it comes to decision making. The first, and I think the most important reason, is that it is right. It is a matter of basic social justice. We make up more than 50% of the population, so therefore it stands to reason, and frankly it should require no further explanation that we should have equal representation in decision-making bodies, and it is unacceptable in this day and age that that is still not the case. The second reason is one that's important to everybody across society. Having women properly represented in decision-making leads to better decisions. It means that before decisions are taken, discussions encompass a broader range of perspectives and consider a much wider range of issues. So that's why the government has and will continue to argue so strongly for gender equality in the boardroom. And in doing that, we see it as being vital that the public sector takes a lead, that the public sector leads by example. The vast majority of Scotland's public bodies, I am glad to say, have now committed to achieving gender balance on their boards by 2020. Creative Scotland and Scottish Canals have already reached that target. But I believe we should embed that public sector commitment in the law so that it's not voluntary, it is a legal requirement. So I'm confirming today that once the Scotland Bill has been passed, the SNP, if we're re-elected of course, we will bring forward legislation on gender balance on public sector boards in the very first year of the next Parliament, so that that becomes a standard. That's what we will have the power to do by way of legislation, and we will do it. But the public sector will only be part of the solution. We've also got to step up our efforts with the private sector as well. You know, the outcome of the Davis review was a call for companies on the FTSE 100 to have board membership that is 33% female by 2020. Frankly, that is simply not ambitious enough. If the public sector can aim for 50%, then the private sector should be aiming for 50% by 2022. Major private firms like Virgin Money, the Alliance Trust, have already signed up to our Partnership for Change initiative, which encourages 50% representation by 2020, and we are determined to encourage many more to do so. And in doing that, we'll make the point, as I mentioned earlier, that it's not simply the right thing to do, although it is the right thing to do, but it's also in companies' own best interest to do it, because they get better decision-making as a result of that. And of course, the arguments for public bodies and for private companies embracing diversity and equality also apply, and in many ways they apply to an even greater extent to political parties and to political institutions. They apply to our local authorities and our national parliament and our cabinet just as much as they do to the boardrooms of public organisations or private companies. And that is why I am such a strong supporter of today's event. Women 50/50, I think, has identified a vitally important cause. We all know how important it is, but they're doing so, I think, at an immensely significant time. And I would encourage all political leaders, and indeed everybody across society, whether they are male or female, to endorse this campaign. I think Scotland is potentially, and I stress potentially because there is more work to do, but I believe Scotland is potentially at a tipping point in relation to gender equality. Social attitudes have progressed significantly here, as they have done in many other countries around the world. We've currently got a Scottish Parliament where the presiding officer and the leaders of all of the three main political parties are women. Not bad for a wee country that's often had a very macho reputation. We also have a gender-balanced cabinet, and when I appointed the gender-balanced cabinet last year, well, I got lots of emails, of course, asking me how I knew all the women in my cabinet were there on merit. I didn't get a single email asking me how I knew any of them all the men. They're all there on merit. But you know, see, on this merit point, we've got to turn that on its head. We are more than 50% of the population. So unless we're saying that somehow women are less meritorious than men, then the question should be, is everybody there in merit? Not when boards or cabinets are gender balanced, it's when they're not gender balanced that that question should be raised. So let's turn that whole argument on its head. But last year when I appointed that cabinet, it was reported back then as being one of only 3 in the developed world, something that I found both dispiriting, that there were only 3 in the developed world, but also a source of pride that Scotland's was one of them. But of course it was great to see Canada join that list just last year. And of course we saw during the referendum campaign on both sides